The rain had already stopped by the time they lowered her into the ground, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the storm itself. Michael Carter stood at the edge of the grave with his hands folded so tightly in front of him that his fingers had gone numb. He didn't notice there were many things he no longer noticed: cold, time, the low murmur of prayers drifting past his ears without meaning. All of it felt distant, like sound heard underwater. What he did notice was the house waiting for him. And even as the casket disappeared beneath the soil, his mind kept circling back to it, the white two-story home on Maple Ridge Road, Hune Trive Non Femmes, the place he had poured 23 years of his life into. The place he believed had been built brick by brick with sacrifice, long nights, postponed dreams, and the quiet agreement of a marriage that was supposed to last until the end. Yeah, it had been her favorite place on earth, or so he thought. The people around him offered condolences in practiced tones. Some touched his shoulder, others avoided his eyes as if grief were contagious. He accepted each gesture with a polite nod, storing them away in a part of his mind that functioned mechanically, like muscle memory. He noticed how some of them lingered too long, how a few glances passed between family members that did not include him. At the time, he chalked it up to discomfort. Nobody knows how to look at a widower. His brother, Ethan, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, head bowed. He looked the part: somber suit, subdued expression, the image of loyal family. When he finally stepped forward and wrapped Michael in a brief embrace, it felt stiff, almost obligatory. If you need anything, Ethan said quietly, already pulling back. Michael nodded. Thank you. The words fell hollow, but he meant them, at least he thought he did. An hour later, the grave was covered, the crowd thinned, life continued in small, indifferent ways. Engines started, doors closed. Someone laughed too loudly across the cemetery, then apologized in a whisper. By mid-afternoon, Michael found himself alone in his car, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at his reflection in the windshield. He barely recognized the man looking back. The drive home passed in fragments. Traffic lights, familiar turns. The grocery store on the corner where they used to argue about what brand of coffee to buy, the bakery she loved, the one that closed early on Sundays. Everything felt like a memory that no longer belonged to him. When he pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had: neat lawn, trimmed hedges, the porch light already on out of habit. But something was wrong. He couldn't have said what, not one Ferriu, but something was wrong. He couldn't have said what, not yet, only that the place felt guarded. Less like a home, more like a building waiting to see what he would do. Michael sat in the car for a full minute before opening the door. Inside, the air was stale. He hadn't been home since the night she died, since the frantic sirens, the hospital lights, the doctor's careful voice explaining that there was nothing more they could do. Friends had insisted he stay with them. He had agreed without thinking. Now, as he stepped into the living room, the quiet pressed in from all sides. The furniture was untouched. The family photos still lined the mantel. Smiling vacations, holiday gatherings. Ethan was in several of them, arms slung casually around his wife's shoulders, always present, always welcome. Michael had never questioned it. Why would he? Blood was blood. Family was safety. He dropped his keys onto the entry table and moved further inside. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, each second a reminder that time did not pause for grief. Her coat still hung by the door, her shoes sat neatly by the stairs. The faint trace of her perfume lingered in the air, and for a moment, his chest tightened so painfully he had to steady himself against the wall. This was what they meant when they said grief came in waves. It hit without warning, pulled him under, then receded, leaving him exhausted and hollow. Michael spent the rest of the afternoon drifting from room to room. He sat on the edge of the bed they had shared, staring at the empty pillow. He stood in the kitchen, fingers brushing the counter where she used to rest her hand while talking to him about her day. He opened the fridge to find meals prepared days in advance, labeled in her tidy handwriting. She had always planned ahead. As evening approached, the light shifted through the windows, casting long shadows across the walls. The house creaked in familiar ways, settling for the night. At some point, Michael realized he hadn't eaten all day. He didn't care. A stack of mail waited on the kitchen table, neatly aligned, sympathy cards, bills, official-looking envelopes edged in white and blue. He flipped through them absently, more out of routine than interest, until one envelope caught his attention. It was addressed to his wife, not unusual, except for the return address, a legal firm downtown, one he didn't recognize. Michael frowned slightly and set it aside. He wasn't ready for paperwork, not tonight. He poured himself a glass of water and sat alone at the kitchen table, listening to the refrigerator hum. His eyes drifted back to the envelope. Something about it unsettled him, but he dismissed the feeling as exhaustion. Grief had a way of turning everything into a threat. He left it unopened. That night, sleep came in short, fractured stretches. He dreamed of the house collapsing inward, the walls folding like paper, rooms rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking. He woke just before dawn, heart pounding, the echo of something unspoken lingering in his mind. The next morning passed in silence. No tears came. Those had been spent earlier, somewhere between the hospital hallway and the cemetery soil. Now there was only a dull ache and a growing sense of disorientation. Friends checked in, family called. Ethan left a voicemail reminding him not to rush into anything, to take his time with decisions. Michael listened to the message twice, uncertain why it bothered him. Kakenges. By the third day, the legal correspondence could no longer be ignored. Appointments were scheduled, documents needed signing. The practical machinery of death rolled forward, indifferent to how unprepared he felt. Michael sat in his home office, sorting through paperwork when he noticed something strange. A file was missing. It was subtle, the kind of absence only someone meticulous would detect. A folder containing property documents, mortgage statements, insurance records, correspondence accumulated over decades. He searched through the filing cabinet twice, then a third time, slower. He checked boxes in the closet, then the safe beneath the floor panel in his study. Nothing. A cow. A knot formed in his stomach. He told himself there was a reasonable explanation. She had handled some of the paperwork. Perhaps she moved it. Perhaps Ethan had helped organize things during the hospital stay. The thought came uninvited, and Michael pushed it away. His brother had been nothing but supportive, present, helpful. Still, the unease remained. And yet that evening he found himself standing in the living room, staring at the family portrait above the fireplace. It was taken 10 years earlier, in front of the very house they now occupied. His wife stood between the two brothers, smiling brightly, hands touching both of them as if to keep everyone balanced. Michael remembered the day clearly. He had insisted on retaking the photo because the angle made the house look uneven. She had laughed and told him it didn't matter. It's just a picture, she'd said. He wondered now what else she had decided didn't matter. Over the next few days, subtle irregularities presented themselves. Small things at first, accounts he did not recognize when reviewing bank statements. A credit card in her name alone closed months before her death, insurance documents filed separately from everything else. Each discovery chipped away at his sense of stability. Still, Michael did not panic. He had always been a man who believed answers existed, even if they took time to surface. He told himself this was merely the messy residue of her life being dismantled. But somewhere beneath that calm reasoning, a different thought began to take shape. The house felt wrong because it was wrong. The walls no longer felt like shelter. They felt like witnesses. One afternoon, as Michael sorted through another box of old files, he came across a notebook tucked beneath outdated tax records. It was not his handwriting. It was hers, neat, deliberate, a personal ledger of sorts. He flipped through it slowly. Most of it was mundane, appointments, reminders, names with phone numbers he didn't recognize, and then about halfway through, something stopped him. A date, a name Ethan, next to it a note written in shorthand, almost careful in its simplicity. Plans, transfers, trust meeting. Michael's breath caught. He closed the notebook and sat back in his chair, staring at the far wall. His mind raced forward, then backward, searching memory for context. Brothers shared responsibilities sometimes. Family matters, estate planning. There were innocent explanations. There always were, until there weren't. He placed the notebook back where he found it and where he found it, as though touching it too long might solidify the implication forming in his mind. The house creaked again, not settling this time, but protesting. Michael rose slowly and walked through each room with renewed awareness. He noticed how some drawers had been rearranged, how certain documents normally kept in common spaces were gone, how easily someone could move unnoticed through the house while he was working late, or traveling, or trusting. Again, that night he stood in the kitchen long after sunset, lights off, staring out at the darkened street. The house reflected faintly in the glass, a double image distorted. For the first time since the funeral, grief gave way to something sharper, doubt. And doubt, once planted, does not remain small for long. As Michael turned away from the window, his eyes landed once more on the stack of unopened mail. The legal envelope sat on top now, as if waiting patiently. This time, he picked it up. He did not know it yet, but the moment his fingers touched that paper, the house he believed he owned began to slip further from his grasp, and the life he thought he understood quietly started to rearrange itself in the dark. The envelope was heavier than it should have been. Michael felt it the moment he tore it open, as if the paper itself carried weight beyond ink and legal language. He stood at the kitchen counter, the house quiet again, waiting. Outside, a car passed on Maple Ridge Road, tires hissing softly against damp pavement, life moving on unconcerned. Kink. Inside the envelope were documents folded with clinical precision, headers in bold type, legal phrases arranged in neat, unforgiving columns. Michael scanned them at first the way anyone does, looking for familiar words, dates that rang bells, anchors of understanding. His eyes caught on one phrase and stalled, irrevocable living trust. He frowned, reread it, then let his gaze drift downward. The name of the property was listed next the address. His address, Maple Ridge Road. A small, almost embarrassed smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. This must be a clerical mix-up. Lawyers made mistakes all the time. He told himself that even as his pulse began to climb, he read on. The trust had been established 8 years earlier. Michael's brow furrowed. 8 years ago, he and his wife had finished paying off the mortgage. 8 years ago, he had taken a week off work just to stand in the backyard, hands on his hips, admiring the place the way a man admires something he believes is finally unquestionably his. And he remembered opening the final bank statement, the paid-in full notification, the quiet pride he felt, not loud or boastful, but solid, earned. The document in his hands suggested a different reality. He turned the page, the grantor, his wife. The trustee, listed below in clean, unmistakable type, Ethan Carter. The room seemed to tilt. Michael gripped the counter and waited for the strange dizziness to pass. His mind rejected what his eyes insisted was there, as if refusing entry to an intruder wearing his brother's face. Ethan, he read the name again slowly this time, letter by letter, as though spelling it differently might change what it meant. It didn't. I want. According to the trust, legal ownership of the house had been transferred years ago, quietly, completely out of Michael's name and into a private entity overseen by his younger brother. No company ownership, no spousal consent, no signature from him, nothing. Michael flipped back through the pages, hands steady despite the bees now buzzing in his chest. He scanned for his name, expecting to see himself listed somewhere, anywhere, beneficiary, company trustee, something that acknowledged the decades he had worked to keep a roof over their heads. He was mentioned once, occupant. The word seemed to mock him from the page, occupant, as if he were a tenant unaware of his own lease, as if the house had never truly been his only borrowed space generously allowed by others. His stomach twisted. He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the wood scraping softly against the tile. The chair across from him, the one she always used, sat empty, angled slightly inward the way she used to leave it. The absurd normality of the scene made the betrayal sting deeper. This wasn't possible. It simply wasn't. Michael prided himself on being careful. He read what he signed, he asked questions, he tracked payments. He remembered every major financial decision they had ever made because he had been the one responsible for making it happen. He closed his eyes and tried to recall signing anything even remotely similar to what lay in front of him. There was nothing, not a single moment of uncertainty, no documents to Pallerton Africaine. There was nothing, not a single moment of uncertainty. No documents, no meetings, no explanation, which meant only one thing. It had been done without him. His mind began, unbidden, to walk backward through time. 8 years ago, his job had required more travel. Weeks away on consulting projects, crisscrossing states, staying in anonymous hotels with beige walls and humming air conditioners. He remembered trusting that things were handled at home, not because he was careless, but because he believed in the structure of his life. He believed in his marriage, he believed in his brother. Ethan had always been there. Family dinners, Thanksgiving, Christmas mornings with forced smiles and overcooked turkey. Ethan bringing wine, offering to help with repairs, sitting at the kitchen table late into the night while Michael talked about work and finances. "I don't know how you keep everything together," Ethan had said once, almost admiringly. Michael smiled at the time, took it as brotherly respect. Now the memory felt different, predatory. Michael rose and crossed the room, spreading the documents out on the table under stronger light. He examined dates, notary stamps, signatures. Her signature was unmistakable, confident, deliberate, no hesitation. The trust had not been hurried. It had been planned he found the transfer deed next, buried beneath the trust paperwork. The legal language was dense, but he forced himself through it slowly. The home had been transferred under the justification of estate planning efficiencies and asset protection from what? From him? A sound escaped his throat then, low and involuntary. It might have been a laugh. It might have been something else entirely. He couldn't have told you. He stood there a long time, staring at those pages as the afternoon light shifted across the countertop. Every now and then, another memory surfaced like a shard of glass rising through water. The way she insisted on handling certain mail herself, the quiet discussions she took upstairs when Ethan visited, the time Ethan joked, half serious, about how houses were just paper anyway. Michael had smiled back then. Thought nothing of it, he slowly gathered the documents and placed them neatly into a folder. His movements were careful, almost ceremonial. Panic would come later, if at all. Right now, something else took hold, something colder. He needed confirmation. The next morning, he dressed as though preparing for an ordinary appointment, neutral clothes, calm expression, no visible fracture. He drove downtown to the law firm listed on the documents, parking 2 blocks away without realizing why. Perhaps instinct had already begun adjusting his behavior. Inside, the office smelled faintly of polish and old books. Soft carpet muffled his steps. A woman at the front desk greeted him with a professional smile. "Kya, I have questions regarding a trust," he said evenly. She checked a computer screen, then motioned for him to sit. "Have a seat, someone will be right with you." The waiting area was quiet. A framed photograph of the city skyline hung slightly crooked on the wall. Michael noticed that too. When the attorney finally arrived, she introduced herself and led him into a glass-walled conference room. Her voice was calm, practiced, trusting. Michael placed the folder on the table and opened it. "I want to understand this," he said, tapping the documents, "because I believe there has been a mistake." She adjusted her glasses and reviewed the papers, nodding occasionally. When she looked up, something had shifted in her expression. Subtle, but unmistakable. "There isn't a mistake here," she said carefully. Michael waited. "The trust was said that's she calculated, Sam. Your wife established it with full legal capacity. It's been active for years." He leaned forward slightly. "I didn't consent." The attorney paused. "Spousal consent wasn't required under the circumstances. The property was retitled prior to full payoff." Michael felt his jaw tighten. Anding name. Property was retitled prior to full payoff. Michael felt his jaw tighten. "I paid the mortgage." "Yes," she said. "According to records, you did." "Okay, so how the title was transferred into the trust while the mortgage was still active," she explained. "That's not uncommon." He stared at her, the words settling heavily between them. "And the trustee?" he asked. She glanced down again, as if hoping the name might have changed. "Ethan Carter." Michael sat back slowly. The attorney spoke again, her voice gentler now. "If it's any comfort, you were listed as an occupant with lifetime residency rights until the trust terms matured." Michael almost laughed. "9 owed lifetime, and then nada nummo." "Lifetime," he said quietly. "Whose lifetime?" She didn't answer. By the time he left the office, the city felt louder. Too sharp, horns blared. People brushed past him on the sidewalk, unaware that something fundamental had been ripped from beneath his feet. He got into his car and sat there, breathing carefully, hands flat against the steering wheel. Ethan knew. Of course he knew. The realization hit with brutal clarity. This wasn't a legal maneuver gone wrong. This wasn't a technical oversight. It was intentional, calculated, decided long before the funeral flowers and whispered condolences. Michael thought of every family gathering held in that house after the transfer. Every time Ethan walked through the front door as a guest, knowing full well he was legally a host. Every smile had weight now. Every kindness carried a shadow. That evening, Michael returned to the house and stood in the entryway for a long time without moving. The walls felt closer than before, not suffocating. Observant, he wandered into the living room and studied the furniture, the shelves, the framed photographs still smiling back at him. He understood now why the house had felt different since the funeral. It hadn't changed. His understanding of it had. The place was no longer a sanctuary, it was evidence. Evidence of how thoroughly he had been excluded from his own life. Michael poured himself a glass of water and drank it slowly, grounding himself in the physical sensation. He thought of Ethan's voice at the cemetery. "If you need anything," he set the glass down. Michael did not cry. The time for that had passed. Instead, he sat at the table where the trust documents lay neatly stacked and began to list everything he could remember, every conversation, Every unexplained decision, every moment that now demanded re-examination. He was somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked as the structure cooled for the night. Michael ignored it. Okay, he was no longer the man who needed comfort from walls or roofs, and he was a man who had just learned the truth. And truth, he understood now, was the most dangerous foundation of all. Memory does not break all at once. It fractures. Michael learned that slowly over the days that followed, as the truth he had uncovered began to press backward through his life, rearranging everything it touched. Moments he once regarded as harmless now surfaced with edges sharp enough to cut. Jokes, silences, small decisions that no longer felt small. He did not rush. Panic was a luxury for those who had nothing to lose. Michael had already lost more than most men ever realized was possible. The kitchen table became his anchor point. Each morning, he sat there with a cup of coffee growing cold, files spread before him like a map of a territory he had once believed was home. Legal documents, bank statements, old email printouts he had requested through formal channels, careful not to leave a digital trace that might alert anyone. He moved methodically, the way he always had at work, no assumptions, no conclusions until patterns emerged. And patterns did emerge. At first, it was financial. Payments routed through accounts that didn't align with household spending. Transfers timed around his business trips. Consulting fees that never quite added up. Ethan's name surfaced more often than coincidence should allow. Consulting advice, informal loans, reimbursements for expenses Michael could not remember approving. Then there were the dates, certain transactions clustered around anniversaries and holidays, Thanksgiving weekends, summers when Michael had been away for weeks at a time. The years overlapped too perfectly with the establishment of the trust, the slow siphoning of control away from him. Still, nothing explicitly proved what his instincts now screamed. Michael needed more than suspicion. He needed confirmation. He turned next to what remained of his wife's digital life. Accessing her laptop felt invasive at first, like crossing a line that should have remained sacred. He hesitated with the device open in front of him, fingers resting on the edge of the keyboard, a familiar ache rising in his chest. And he pushed it down. Truth was not betrayal, silence was. He worked through backups stored on an external drive he recognized, one she used frequently for personal organization. Email archives, photo libraries, notes synced from her phone. At first glance, everything looked ordinary: family photos, recipes, notes for birthdays and appointments, carefully maintained normalcy. Michael almost closed it all and walked away. Almost. Then he noticed folders nested just deeply enough not to be accidental. Names abbreviated, dates instead of descriptions. A pattern that stood out precisely because it tried so hard not to. He opened one. Inside were hundreds of images, not explicit, not careless, just enough to understand everything. A hand resting on another in the reflection of a window, a partial smile captured in dim light, a familiar watch, Ethan's visible in the corner of a photo. Taken in what Michael now recognized as the guest bedroom. Photos meant never to be found. They told a story without words, intimacy coded as secrecy, moments preserved not for passion but for remembrance. Proof of a life quietly existing parallel to the one Michael believed he shared. The timestamp stretched back more than a decade. Michael leaned back, nausea rolling through him slowly, deliberately, as though his body wanted him to feel every second of it. This wasn't an affair born of loneliness or momentary weakness. It was infrastructure, scheduled, protected, engineered. What hollowed him most was not the images themselves. It was the discipline behind them, the restraint, the shared understanding that this was something to be guarded carefully rather than consumed recklessly. It meant they had thought about consequences. It meant they had planned around him. And Michael closed the folder and sat in the quiet. The refrigerator clicked on behind him. Outside, a lawn sprinkler hissed briefly on a neighbor's property, then fell silent. He thought of Ethan's presence at family gatherings, how easily he moved through the house, how jokes landed effortlessly, how his wife's laughter always came a half beat sooner when Ethan spoke harmless, he had told himself. Family, he had told himself. He began replaying specific memories, one by one. The year Ethan started visiting more often. The way he stayed late, lingering after dinner while Michael washed dishes. The sudden ease with which Ethan accessed spaces that once felt private. His study, the upstairs hallway, the guest room. The years Michael worked longer hours to secure promotions and bonuses. Those bonuses that paid for renovations, repairs, additions to the home, for their home, no, for theirs. Michael felt something inside his chest tighten. Not anger yet, not fully, but a clean, cutting clarity. Caution larid. Aspi. His role in their arrangement became unmistakable in retrospect. He had not been betrayed impulsively. He had been used. And use implied purpose. That night he dreamed again, but this time the house stood intact. Lights were on in rooms he had never entered. He walked through familiar hallways only to find doors had been added where there were none before, locked ones. He woke before dawn, the weight of the realization settling fully for the first time. They hadn't just stolen the house, they had built plans inside it while he funded the walls. Michael stopped sleeping after that. He didn't need rest, he needed understanding. He needed to know how far it went. He revisited bank records and cross-referenced them with Ethan's professional history. Ethan hadn't struggled financially the way Michael thought he had. Certain ventures failed publicly but succeeded quietly. Michael realized now how often he had stepped in, helped with down payments, company-signed loans, offered bridge support during temporary setbacks. And support never repaid. Why would it have been when Ethan had already secured something far more valuable? Michael had financed more than a lifestyle, he had financed leverage. What cut deepest was not the betrayal of flesh or blood, but of intellect. They believed they were smarter than him, that keeping him ignorant was not only possible but necessary, that he would never see. Michael stood one afternoon in the living room, staring once again at the family portrait above the mantel. The image no longer pained him, it instructed him. She stood in the center, balanced, a quiet smile on her face as though she knew exactly how the story ended. He took the photo down and placed it face down on the shelf. He was careful from then on. Careful not to ask questions too loudly, careful not to behave differently when Ethan called to check in, careful not to tip the balance of the illusion they still believed intact. Michael learned how to listen without responding. He noticed how Ethan spoke about the house now, subtly possessive without outright claiming it. Phrases like that place, and when things settle, Michael nodded along. He learned how to grieve quietly in spaces where no one could observe him. Anger would come later. Right now, grief was too loud, it risked exposure. Patience, Michael realized, wasn't passivity, it was preparation. He began documenting everything, copies layered over copies, metadata preserved, financial discrepancies annotated and archived. Emotional proof cataloged with the same precision he had once applied to annual budgets and forecasting reports. He was building something new now, not a home, a record. And late one evening, as rain tapped against the windows again, Michael sat alone in the study and felt something settle inside him. Not peace, but alignment. The fog of confusion had burned away, leaving a single undeniable truth in its place. Blood had never been loyalty, and trust had never been guaranteed, and grief did not require him to be silent. And he closed his laptop slowly, the reflection of his face dark in the screen. The house stood around him, unchanged, unaware that the man inside it had finally accepted what it truly was. Not a refuge, a crime scene, Dutch work. And Michael Carter had just begun to understand how patiently crimes could be paid for, sometimes years before justice ever arrived. Michael Carter did not vanish all at once. If anyone had been asked later, they would have said he merely faded, became smaller, somehow. The kind of man grief erodes without spectacle, the kind people stop expecting anything from. That, Michael understood, was the most useful version of himself. He stopped attending family dinners first. No confrontation, no refusal, just polite excuses delivered with tired courtesy. Headaches, work obligations, not feeling up to it. Each explanation reinforced the story everyone was already comfortable believing, that grief had hollowed him out. Ethan accepted it easily. In fact, Ethan seemed relieved. Michael noticed that too. The phone calls slowed. The check-ins became brief and increasingly one-sided. Ethan spoke as someone addressing a man already behind him in life, not beside him. There was kindness in his tone, but also finality, as if Michael belonged to a chapter that had already ended. Michael encouraged the belief. He let his voice soften when he did answer, let pauses stretch uncomfortably long, let Ethan offer advice without resistance. He even thanked him once for looking out for things. That moment told Michael a great deal. People who feel secure in what they've taken often mistake gratitude for surrender. Behind closed doors, Michael was busier than he had ever been. He converted the guest bedroom into a workspace, careful to leave the rest of the house untouched, unchanged. Anyone walking through would still see a grieving widower frozen in time. Only that one room carried evidence of motion. Stacks of documents lined the desk, not messily but arranged by category. Trust law, estate, planning statutes. Case studies pulled from public records, old court decisions, bookmarked and annotated. Michael learned the language first, not emotionally, structurally. He learned how trusts were created and, more importantly, how they were exploited. How asset protection could become asset concealment with just enough plausible intent. How signatures could be legally valid yet ethically rotten. Purim, Dormentium, he discovered, was rarely dramatic. It did not look like a shaky hand or excess ink. It looked like familiarity, comfort, letters written by someone who had spent years watching another's handwriting closely. Michael pulled older from storage, Kummerish, Mernderas from Grestaff. Michael pulled older documents from storage, birthday cards, grocery lists, notes his wife once left on the refrigerator. He compared them slowly, methodically, against the trust paperwork. His findings were instructive. The signatures were real, or real enough, but patterns were missing, inflections absent, pressure inconsistent, not forged in haste, but imitated over time. The kind of imitation done by someone with access, someone trusted, someone related. Michael scanned everything, preserving high-resolution copies across encrypted storage. He labeled nothing emotionally. No betrayal, no affair. Only neutral terminology, dates, categories, relationships, emotion. He understood, corrupted clarity. By the third week, he had stopped leaving the house except for necessities. Neighbors waved sympathetically. Some tried conversation. He responded kindly but briefly, never inviting further inquiry. Isolation, like ignorance, could be weaponized if controlled properly. At night, he studied financial trails. Trusts left footprints even when designed to obscure them, small inconsistencies. Tax filings that told one story while internal transfers suggested another. Payments funneled through innocuous shell accounts named after forgettable acronyms. Michael followed them patiently. He pulled public records late into the night, hunting for connections Ethan had assumed no one would ever look for. He mapped relationships the way an investigator might. Business partners, legal contacts, accountants who appeared more frequently than coincidence allowed. He did not move quickly. Speed brought mistakes. The days blended together. Grief still existed, but it no longer controlled him. It had been demoted from master to background noise. And that was when Ethan made his mistake. The call came on a Sunday afternoon. "I'm going by the house tomorrow," Ethan said, casual, familiar, just to check on things. Make sure everything's okay structurally, roof, basement, that kind of stuff. Can Michael let silence stretch just long enough to communicate weakness? "Sure, that's fine, thank you." "Of course," Ethan replied. "You don't need to worry about anything right now." Michael nearly smiled. When Ethan arrived the next day, Michael wasn't there. He had left early, intentionally, after disabling a very specific setting on his home security system, one Ethan didn't know existed. The cameras went dark at obvious points. They recorded quietly elsewhere. Michael reviewed the footage later that evening from a cafe across town, his laptop angled discreetly away from other patrons. Ethan walked through the house with confidence now. No longer a guest, he checked rooms, opened drawers, examined shelves. In the study, he lingered too long near the filing cabinet. Then he made a call. Michael couldn't hear the audio clearly, but he didn't need to. Body language told a sufficient story. Comfort, familiarity, reassurance. Michael noted the timestamp, cross-referenced it later with phone records, then added the entry to his growing archive. He returned home that night to find the house exactly as he left it. Ethan had been careful, too careful. Michael sat in the darkened living room for a long time, where Tibbets Kurtraki to the muted of the prophet of the clock. He felt no satisfaction yet, only confirmation. Ethan believed the house was already his prize. Prizes made people careless eventually. Over the next month, Michael deepened his study. He learned how trusts collapsed not through loud accusations, but through exposure of intent. Fraud rarely survived scrutiny when motive was laid bare, and motive, Michael realized, was everywhere. He uncovered correspondence between Ethan and the attorney's office, saved innocently in a shared cloud account, never disconnected. Email chains discussing long-term security, comments about timelines, contingencies, knowledge, planned around, not just emotionally, institutionally. That knowledge settled into Michael's bones like ice. He did not recoil from it. He documented it. Meanwhile, he played his role. He returned Ethan's calls less frequently. When he did, he sounded tired, distracted. Once, he apologized for not being himself lately. Ethan assured him there was nothing to apologize for. Michael thanked him again. Grief, he learned, disarmed suspicion entirely. By summer, most people had stopped asking how he was doing. They had accepted the narrative of a man gently receding from relevance. Okay, Michael encouraged this by making one visible, strategic concession. He met with a local real estate agent. Word traveled quickly. It always did. The idea that Michael might be giving up, solidified the assumption that he was done fighting. That the house, emotionally at least, was already lost, Ethan called that evening. Yang, you don't need to rush anything, he said carefully. Markets fluctuate. You should take care of yourself first. Michael responded softly. I don't think I'm strong enough to fight anymore. There it was the moment. That's okay, Ethan replied, relief barely concealed. You don't have to. Michael ended the call shortly afterward, hands steady. Late that night, he stood again in the hallway and listened to the house around him. Pipes shifted, wood contracted. The quiet workings of a structure that had endured far more than it knew. Michael wasn't disappearing, he was narrowing, stripping away visibility until only intention remained. He understood now that power didn't announce itself. It arranged conditions. It waited, and as the image of a broken man became more convincing to the world outside, Michael Carter completed the most important transformation of all. He stopped thinking like someone who had been wronged. He began thinking like someone who would be believed. Somewhere ahead, the trap was already forming, not with confrontation, but with silence, not with anger, but with evidence. And by the time anyone realized Michael had never truly vanished at all, it would be far too late to step back out of the closing door. Michael left the house on a Thursday morning, no announcement, no argument, no dramatic confrontation where truth spilled into the open. He packed only what he needed, clothes, personal items, a handful of books, nothing sentimental, nothing heavy. He moved through the rooms with the calm efficiency of someone checking off a list that had already been written. And the rest he left behind. Furniture remained where it had always been. Photographs stayed on the walls. Even the coat by the door was untouched. To anyone watching, it would have looked as though Michael expected to return, as though this were temporary. That illusion mattered. He locked the door gently behind him, palms resting on the cool metal for a moment longer than necessary. Not because he felt sentiment, but because he understood symbolism. Endings that appeared incomplete unsettled people. They invited assumptions. Michael wanted Ethan to assume everything. He didn't drive far. Just 20 miles east, into a furnished apartment rented month to month under his own name, paid in cash. Plain. Unremarkable, the kind of place people only occupied when they were passing through something. Within a week, Ethan moved in. Michael learned this not through conversation, but through silence. The house no longer registered activity when he checked county utilities. Power usage rose subtly. Water consumption shifted. Patterns resumed. The patterns of someone living, not visiting. Ethan didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. Ownership, even fraudulent ownership, had a way of breeding confidence. And confidence loosened discipline faster than arrogance ever could. Michael imagined Ethan walking through the front door for the first time as a resident. Imagined him pausing in the entryway, letting the air settle around him. Imagined him touching the walls, the banister, the counter Michael once leaned against while morning coffee brewed. Michael felt no surge of rage at the thought, only confirmation. The house was exactly where Michael needed it to be. Friends asked questions when word spread. Michael fielded them gently, vaguely. He told people he needed space, that the memories were too heavy, that sometimes stepping away was healthier than clinging to what hurt. They nodded sympathetically. No one questioned a grieving widower surrendering ground. Ethan, meanwhile, grew bolder. He hosted guests. Michael knew because cars appeared in the driveway during hours the house once sat dark. Because the porch light flicked on and off at irregular times. Because laughter occasionally drifted into recordings that Michael's cameras still captured quietly, faithfully. The system was still his. Ethan hadn't noticed. Michael did not attend the gatherings, did not drive by. He didn't need proximity anymore. He had shifted from observation to execution. Weeks earlier, he had begun releasing information, not all at once, not recklessly. CAC pieces, an anonymous tip to a state-level revenue office questioning the tax classification of a specific trust. A packet mailed without return address to an ethics committee regarding potential conflicts of interest between a trustee and grantor. An email forwarded, clean, untouched, metadata preserved, to an auditor referencing irregular filings tied to properties transferred under estate planning exceptions. Michael's name appeared nowhere. He understood systems. Systems required triggers, not narratives. Once activated, they moved independent of intent, grinding methodically until inconsistencies surfaced. Auditors did not care about betrayal. They cared about numbers, and the numbers did not like Ethan. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after Ethan moved in. Michael learned about it the same way he learned everything now, indirectly. Phone records showed a spike in calls tied to Ethan's accountant. Stress patterns began forming immediately thereafter. Calls lengthened. Frequencies increased. A man asking questions no longer confident, he liked the answers. Cat Michael poured himself a cup of coffee that morning and allowed himself a rare indulgence, satisfaction. Still, he waited. Audits don't announce conclusions up front. They ask for documents, clarifications, supporting materials. Each request is a small tightening of the net. Ethan complied willingly at first. He was used to being prepared, used to thinking ahead. What he wasn't used to was being examined without warning. Michael continued releasing material, slowly, surgically. He mailed one packet to a zoning authority questioning undocumented renovations made while the property passed through the trust. Another to a lending institution referencing potential misrepresentation during collateral agreements years earlier. Each tip stood alone. Together, they formed a constellation. The house became the focal point, not as a home, but as a file. What Ethan failed to understand was that Michael never cared about reclaiming the structure itself. Buildings were temporary. Ownership was symbolic. What mattered was what the house had quietly absorbed over the years: paper trails, digital records, conversations Ethan believed were private because they happened inside walls he thought he controlled. Authorities asked questions, then more questions. Unscaled inspections occurred. Auditors walked through rooms that once smelled of dinner and holidays, now inhaling dust and intent and oversight. Ethan smiled through it at first. "You know how these things go," he said during one phone call with a colleague. "Once they review it, they'll move on." Michael listened to the recording later, noting the forced optimism, but the reviews didn't end, they deepened. Because once a trust is suspected of shielding assets improperly, everything attached to it is suspect. Every transfer, every signature, every benefit. Michael had anticipated this. He had already layered corroboration beneath his claims. Silent witnesses, former contractors paid under unusual conditions, notaries who listed meeting dates that didn't align with travel records, digital logs Nathan had quietly preserved for years without understanding why. Understanding came later. The pressure began to show. Michael learned Ethan had hired additional legal counsel. Specialized, expensive, discreet. He also learned Ethan had stopped hosting gatherings at the house. The lights went dark more often now. Window coverings closed. Victory no longer felt celebratory. Michael sat alone in his apartment most evenings. Reviewing correspondences that never mentioned him yet circled closer to the truth he had uncovered. He remained invisible. That invisibility was work, restraint was. There were moments, quiet ones, where the weight returned. Grief resurfacing unexpectedly when he passed a bakery window or caught the scent of coffee blending with rain. When he remembered the version of his wife he loved before knowledge reframed everything, Michael allowed those moments space. Then he moved forward. One afternoon, a letter arrived for Ethan that Michael never saw but learned about anyway. Subpoena language, requests for statements under oath, clarification of fiduciary conduct. That was when Ethan called him. And the desperation was subtle, masked as concern. "I've been meaning to check in," Ethan said. "These things can get complicated. The house, it might help if we stayed coordinated." Michael paused before responding deliberately. "There doesn't seem much to coordinate anymore," he said quietly. "You own it, a beat." "Well," Ethan replied carefully. On paper, Michael ended the call shortly afterward. He understood now how completely Ethan had miscalculated. He thought Michael's silence was surrender. He believed the absence of protest meant the absence of strategy. He thought survivorship equaled victory. Ethan didn't understand that Michael had needed the house occupied, used, active, full of assumption because a vacant property created fewer questions. A lived-in one revealed everything. Weeks passed, then months. The investigation expanded. Ethan's business relationships began quietly unraveling as partners distanced themselves, not out of guilt, but to protect collateral damage. Trusts frayed under scrutiny. Accounts froze temporarily, then longer. Michael watched it all from a distance, so complete it might as well have been another city. He never checked the news compulsively. He never sought confirmation beyond the data flowing steadily into his possession. This wasn't entertainment, it was process. One evening, Michael stood on his apartment balcony and watched the city dim as the sun set. A passing siren echoed briefly between buildings, then faded. He knew stages like this didn't conclude with explosions. They ended with paperwork, with notices mailed quietly, with signatures demanded under pressure. With people realizing too late that no one was coming to rescue them, the house still stood. Ink and lights still flickered on and off, but it was no longer shelter, it was exposure. And as Michael closed the balcony door behind him and returned to his desk, he understood the final truth with a clarity that brought no joy, only certainty. You can't. Letting them take the house hadn't been loss at all, it had been an invitation. Calypso rarely announces itself with a sound. It begins quietly with things no longer holding where they once did. The first structure to fail wasn't the house. It was trust, legal, professional, and social, all eroding at once, like soil pulled slowly from beneath a foundation no one realized was already hollow. Gethin felt it before he understood it. Phone calls that once returned immediately now went unanswered, meetings postponed without explanation, emails acknowledged with phrases that suggested distance rather than support. We'll circle back. Let's revisit later. This is under review. Michael knew the timing before he ever heard the news. The state audit concluded its preliminary findings on a Tuesday morning, not loudly, not publicly, just enough to trigger mandatory. The trust that had protected Ethan's control was flagged as improperly structured, not because of technical error, but because of intent. The distinction mattered, mistakes could be corrected, intent could not. Investigators followed the paper trail in the only direction it could lead, toward motive, toward coordination, toward the relationship that explained why a man with no financial stake had been granted total authority over an asset he did not purchase. The relationship that explained everything. The affair did not emerge as scandal at first, it emerged as evidence. Messages recovered through subpoenas, photographs once hidden now contextualized by timelines, travel records overlapping with financial transfers, a decade-long pattern of benefit and concealment. Romance was not how authorities described it. They described conspiracy. Michael learned this from a legal brief forwarded anonymously to a regulatory body, a document meant for internal adjudication, not gossip. The language was clinical, devastating, coordinated misrepresentation, intentional exclusion, financial gain derived from concealed relationship. The words were dry, precise, irrefutable. It was not the betrayal alone that destroyed Ethan's position, but the realization that he could no longer claim ignorance. The trust hadn't been an estate planning convenience, it had been insurance against Michael. Michael did not attend a single hearing, not as a witness, not as an observer. His presence was unnecessary. Now, the machinery he had activated functioned independently, fed by facts too solid to ignore. The family learned through whispers first. A cousin mentioning something going on legally, an aunt asking carefully worded questions no one seemed able to answer. Then the story sharpened, passed quietly between phone calls and texts that excluded Michael until someone finally had the decency or curiosity to ask him directly. Is it true about Ethan and about the house? Michael answered simply, calmly, yes, nothing more. He did not explain, did not justify. He had learned that truth required no decoration. The judgment that followed did not land on him. It pivoted. Shock does strange things to people. It does not always inspire sympathy. Sometimes it inspires recalibration. When the story no longer fits the version someone believed, they revise their assumptions rather than abandon the narrative entirely. Michael had been quiet, withdrawn, broken. Ethan had been helpful, present, responsible. Now the roles reversed violently. The trust was dissolved under court supervision. Assets froze pending analysis. Properties tied to it, including the house on Maple Ridge Road, were classified as disputed and removed from Ethan's effective control. Career consequences followed quickly. Ethan's firm placed him on administrative leave pending resolution. Partners distanced themselves. Compliance officers reviewed decisions no one had questioned while profits flowed. Clients withdrew not because they understood the full scope of what Ethan had done, but because uncertainty was contagious. And the affair, once exposed, took on a shape even more damning than infidelity. People learned how long it had lasted, how calculated it was. How many choices had been made with Michael absent, unaware, financing a future never meant to include him. It was not passion that revolted people, it was cruelty disguised as normalcy. A marriage maintained not for love, but for utility. Ethan was summoned to explain himself again and again to lawyers, to partners, to family members whose silence now rang louder than accusation. Each conversation stripped away another layer of confidence. The house went dark. When utilities were reduced to minimum levels under court order. Security monitors were installed, not Michael's this time, but the state's. The place no longer belonged to anyone. Michael learned of Ethan's arrest weeks later through indirect channels, white-collar charges, fraud, misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty. No dramatic spectacle, just an escort out of a downtown building, eyes shielded by professional detachment rather than shame. Now, Ethan didn't fight. There was nothing left to fight with. And Michael was walking through a bookstore when his phone vibrated in his pocket. A single message from an unfamiliar number. "I know this was you." Michael stood between two shelves, hand resting lightly against the wood. He read the message once, then again he did not respond. By the time the trial concluded, in settlements rather than verdicts, Ethan had lost everything he once believed insulated him. His license, his standing, his ability to borrow goodwill from others. Furka. His freedom was reduced to a negotiated arrangement measured in restrictions and reporting requirements. Not prison, but surveillance. Not exile, but erasure, worse. In many ways, Michael watched none of it unfold directly. He needed no front row seat. The outcome had become inevitable the moment Ethan mistook silence for absence. Family gatherings resumed cautiously without Ethan's presence. Conversations that once excluded Michael now angled toward him respectfully, uncertainly. People apologized without quite knowing what they were apologizing for. Michael accepted none of it personally. Judgment, he had learned, was rarely about truth. It was about convenience. One afternoon, months after the collapse, Michael received the final notice regarding the house. The property would be liquidated as part of restitution and dissolution proceedings, proceeds distributed to cover liabilities. Michael signed the last form required of him without hesitation. He did not reclaim the house, and he did not attend the closing. That place had already served its purpose. The following week, Michael stood alone at a quiet cafe, watching pedestrians pass outside the window. He thought of Ethan, not with triumph, not with hatred, but with a distant clarity reserved for systems that break exactly as designed. Ethan had believed himself clever. Michael had been thorough. Raising his voice was never required. The destruction had been complete precisely because it was impersonal. Justice, he understood now, was not loud. It arrived in envelopes, in process servers, in consequences that people could not argue away with charm or bloodlines. And when it finished, it left silence in its wake. The house stood the same way it always had, quiet, white, and waiting. Months had passed since anyone truly lived inside it. The lawn was trimmed by order of the bank, not out of care. The windows were clean, but empty. No light spilled from within now, no laughter, no whispered conversations carried behind carefully closed doors. Michael parked across the street and turned the engine off. He did not get out right away. From where he sat, the house looked smaller than he remembered. Or maybe he had grown larger inside himself. He watched the way the late afternoon sun touched the siding, the familiar angle of shadow stretching toward the driveway. There was nothing mystical about it, nothing sentimental, just a structure. A place where a lie had lived comfortably for a very long time. Michael stepped out of the car and crossed the street slowly. He didn't carry keys. He didn't need them. The front door had been left unsecured for inspections and valuations, its lock no longer anyone's priority. It opened with a tired creak. The smell inside was different now, stale, neutral. The lived-in warmth had been scrubbed away by absence. Every footstep echoed slightly, as if the house itself had forgotten how to hold sound. Michael stood in the entryway and let the memory come fully this time. He remembered moving in, the excitement, the belief that this place marked arrival, that he had built something permanent, something worthy of the sacrifices behind it. He remembered his wife standing in nearly this same spot, laughing as she planned where furniture would go. Those memories no longer cut him, they simply existed. He walked through each room deliberately, not rushing, not lingering. The living room where holidays unfolded and obligations smiled at each other politely. The kitchen where routines formed without notice, and where silence had begun long before the truth ever surfaced. Upstairs, the bedroom felt lighter without furniture, its emptiness honest, no traces left behind. No forced preservation of intimacy that no longer deserved to be romanticized. Michael paused briefly at the guest room, the one that had held more than it pretended. He stood there only long enough to acknowledge what had been, then moved on. There was nothing left to uncover. The house had told its story already. He reached the study last, the room where he had once worked late into nights, believing himself the most informed man in his own life. The place where truth had rearranged itself quietly, without permission. Sunlight filtered through the bare window, illuminating dust where shelves once stood. Michael felt no urge to replace anything. No urge to claim space. Ownership, he understood now, was not about possession, it was about clarity. Ethan had taken the house believing it was the prize, believing it symbolized victory, control, permanence. He had been wrong. The house had never been the reward, it had been proof of planning, proof of intent, proof that betrayal, no matter how patiently executed, still left a record, walls remembered, documents remembered, systems remembered. The house had held everything long enough for the truth to become undeniable. Cat Michael stepped back downstairs and stood near the front door one final time. He did not touch the frame, did not look back. Some endings did not require ceremony. Outside, the air felt lighter. The street was quiet. A neighbor walked by and nodded politely, not fully recognizing him, not needing to. Michael returned the nod and continued toward his car. As he drove away, he did not watch the house disappear in the mirror. He already knew how it ended. The lie that once lived there no longer had anyone to protect it. And the man who had been built into silence had learned something far more valuable than ownership. He had learned the shape of his own strength. Michael didn't reclaim the house because he didn't need to. It had already given him everything he came back for.